Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the cold glass of the observation deck. Stars stretched across the darkness like scattered diamonds. She had dreamed of this moment her entire life. Humanity's first contact with alien life. The research ship Meridian floated quietly in space, waiting for something that would change everything. Elena was alone on the deck. Her teammates were busy in the lab, studying data from the strange signals they had received 3 days ago. The signals came from beyond their solar system. They were clearly artificial, clearly intelligent. After decades of searching, humanity had finally found proof that they were not alone in the universe. She watched the stars and wondered what kind of beings had sent the signals. Would they be friendly? Would they share knowledge? Elena's specialty was xenobiology, the study of alien life forms. She had spent years preparing for this moment, creating theories about how alien life might evolve on different worlds. A flash of light caught her attention. Something was moving toward them from the direction of the signals. Elena grabbed her communicator to call the others, but stopped when she saw what was approaching. The ship was beautiful and terrible at the same time. It looked like it was made of crystal and light, shifting between colors that Elena had never seen before. It was massive, easily 10 times the size of the Meridian. Strange patterns of energy flowed across its surface like living art. "Captain," Elena whispered into her communicator, "you need to see this." Before anyone could respond, the alien ship fired something at them. It was not a weapon, but some kind of beam that wrapped around the Meridian like invisible hands. Elena felt the ship being pulled toward the alien vessel, helpless against the force. Alarms began screaming throughout the ship. Elena heard Captain Morrison's voice over the speakers, ordering all hands to battle stations. She heard the sound of weapons charging, but somehow she knew it was useless. Whatever these aliens were, they were far beyond human technology. The Meridian's weapons fired at the crystal ship. The energy beams simply bounced off without leaving a mark. In response, the alien ship sent a pulse of energy that shut down every system on the human vessel. Life support, weapons, communications. Everything went dark except for emergency lighting. Elena ran toward the main lab, but the ship's corridors had become a maze of sparking wires and emergency lights. She heard screaming from somewhere ahead. When she reached the lab, she found her worst fears confirmed. Her teammates were dead. Captain Morrison lay crumpled near the weapons console. Dr. Chen was slumped over his research station. Dr. Williams had been thrown against the wall by some invisible force. All of them had tried to resist, and all of them had paid the price. Elena was alone. The crystal ship pulled the Meridian into what looked like a massive hangar bay. The walls glowed with soft blue light, and Elena could see other ships floating inside, dozens of them from many different worlds. Some looked like metal insects, others appeared to be grown rather than built. A few seemed to be made of energy itself. Tall figures moved through the hangar bay. Elena got her first look at the aliens who had captured her. They were beautiful in an inhuman way. They stood nearly 8 feet tall with long, thin bodies covered in translucent skin. Beneath their skin, Elena could see organs that glowed with soft light, pulsing in patterns that reminded her of music. The aliens moved with perfect coordination, as if they were all parts of the same mind. They wore no clothing, but their skin changed color and pattern to serve different functions. When they needed to cut through metal, their hands became sharp and hard. When they needed to see into the human ship, their eyes glowed brighter. Elena tried to hide, but it was useless. The aliens seemed to know exactly where she was. They moved through the dead ship with purpose, ignoring the bodies of her teammates and heading straight for her hiding place behind a storage container. When they found her, Elena expected to die quickly like the others. Instead, they simply looked at her with large, multifaceted eyes that reminded her of insects. One of them made a sound like singing crystal, and the others responded in harmony. Elena realized they were communicating. Suddenly, Elena felt a strange tingling in her mind. The aliens were doing something to her thoughts, but it did not hurt. Instead, she began to understand their words without knowing how. "This one is different," the first alien said, though its mouth never moved. The words simply appeared in Elena's mind. "This one studies life. This one seeks to understand." "All specimens seek to understand," replied another. "Understanding is the nature of intelligence. This one will join the archive like all the others." "No," said the first alien. "Look deeper. This one understands not for conquest, but for connection. This one is rare among its species," Elena found her voice. What are you? What do you want? The first alien turned its attention to her fully. When it did, Elena felt like she was being examined by a microscope that could see not just her body, but her thoughts and memories. We are the Kethmori Collective, it said. We preserve, we study, we archive. Your species has reached the threshold of space travel. You have earned a place in our collection. Collection? Elena asked, though she was beginning to understand. Every species that reaches the stars has something unique to offer, the alien explained. Your kind shows unusual creativity and adaptability. We will study these traits. We will learn from them. Then we will integrate them into our understanding of life. And then what happens to us? The alien did not answer directly. Instead, Elena felt images flowing into her mind. She saw world after world, empty and lifeless. She saw the crystal ships of the Kethmori moving between stars like locusts, taking what they needed and leaving nothing behind. She saw vast collections of beings from countless species, all trapped in cages of light and metal. You are the first of your kind to join us, the alien said. You will help us understand humanity. Through you, we will learn what makes your species valuable. Elena was taken from the meridian and brought into the crystal ship. The inside was even more beautiful than the outside, with corridors that seemed to be carved from single pieces of colored glass. Strange music played constantly, the sound of the Kethmori communicating with each other across vast distances. They brought her to what could only be called a zoo. Thousands of transparent cages filled enormous chambers, each one containing a being from a different world. Elena saw creatures that looked like walking plants, others that seemed to be made of living metal, and some that appeared to be pure energy contained in force fields. Her cage was comfortable but clearly inescapable. The walls were made of the same crystal as the ship, but Elena could touch them without being cut. Food appeared when she was hungry, though she could not see where it came from. The air was clean and fresh, maintained at the perfect temperature for human life. But Elena was not thinking about comfort. She was thinking about her dead teammates, about the empty world she had seen in the alien's mind, and about what the Kethmori planned to do to humanity. They had called her the first of her kind to join them, which meant they intended to take more humans. As Elena looked around at the thousands of other prisoners, she realized something that the Kethmori had not yet understood. They had made a mistake. They had assumed that humans were like every other species they had encountered, that they would accept their fate and help their captors understand their race. But Elena was human, and humans had never been good at accepting defeat. As she settled into her cage and began to study her captors, Elena made a promise to herself and to her dead friends. The Kethmori thought they had captured just another specimen for their collection. They had no idea what they had really caught. Elena had been in the crystal cage for 3 months. Every day the Kethmori came to study her. They would shine lights on her body, scan her brain, and ask her questions about human behavior. They were particularly interested in how humans made decisions when they were afraid or angry. The aliens were methodical in their research. They would present Elena with puzzles and watch how she solved them. They showed her images of her dead teammates and measured her emotional responses. They gave her problems that had no correct answers and studied how she handled frustration. What fascinated them most was Elena's refusal to give up. When they gave her an impossible task, other species would eventually accept failure. Elena would keep trying new approaches, sometimes for hours, even when she knew the task was designed to be unsolvable. This behavior is inefficient, one of the researchers told her during a particularly long session. You waste energy on futile efforts. Why do you not accept the logical conclusion? Elena looked up from the puzzle they had given her, a maze that changed its walls every time she made progress. Because maybe you made a mistake. Maybe there is a solution you didn't think of. The Kethmori exchanged those musical sounds that served as their language. Elena had been listening carefully to their communications for months, and she was beginning to understand patterns in their speech. They seemed confused by her answer. We do not make mistakes, the researcher said. We are part of the collective. All knowledge is shared among us. If a solution existed, we would know it. That's your first mistake, Elena said, continuing to work on the puzzle, thinking you know everything. During her captivity, Elena learned more about the Kethmori than they realized she was learning. They were indeed a collective consciousness, but not in the way humans might imagine. Each individual could think independently, but their thoughts were constantly shared with the group. This made them incredibly efficient at organizing and sharing information, but it also made them predictable. Elena discovered that the Kethmori had been conquering species for over 3,000 years. They would arrive at a world, study the dominant species, and then take a few specimens before stripping the planet of its resources. The specimens would be kept alive long enough to provide complete information about their species' biology, culture, and technology. Then they would be eliminated, and the Kethmori would move on to the next world. What made the Kethmori so successful was their ability to integrate the knowledge they gathered. Each species they conquered added new capabilities to their civilization. They had learned space travel from a race of energy beings, weapon technology from a militant species called the Warforged, and their crystal architecture from creatures that grew their own cities. But Elena also learned something that the Kethmori did not want her to know. The other prisoners in the vast zoo were not just random specimens. They were the last survivors of their species. Every other member of their races was dead, their worlds stripped bare and lifeless. Elena was not just a prisoner. She was possibly the last human who would ever live. This knowledge should have broken her spirit, but instead, it made her angry. Elena had always been a quiet person, more interested in understanding life than fighting. But as she watched the other prisoners in their cages, she felt something growing inside, her that the Kethmori had not yet catalogued. In their studies of human emotion, she felt rage. Elena began to pay attention to the other prisoners in ways that her captors did not notice. During feeding times, when the Kethmori would open her cage briefly to provide food, she would make eye contact with the beings in nearby cages. She started with simple gestures, nods, waves, expressions that might translate across species barriers. The being in the cage to her left looked like a spider the size of a large dog, but with translucent silk that sparkled with its own light. Elena had been watching it weave complex patterns in its cage, patterns that seemed too elaborate to be random. One day she traced a simple mathematical sequence in the air with her finger. The spider creature stopped weaving and looked at her directly. Then it began to modify its web pattern to match Elena's sequence. The creature in the cage to her right was harder to communicate with. It appeared to be made of gas contained in a force field, shifting between different colors and densities. But Elena noticed that its color changes followed patterns too, especially when the Kethmori researchers were nearby. She began to shift her own position in response to the creature's color changes, and slowly, they developed a basic system of communication. Elena's background in xenobiology was crucial to these early contacts. She had spent years studying how different forms of life might evolve, and she could recognize intelligence even when it took unfamiliar forms. More importantly, she could guess how different types of beings might perceive and interact with their environment. The Kethmori noticed that their specimens were becoming more active, but they attributed this to normal psychological responses to long-term captivity. They had seen similar patterns in other species before. What they failed to recognize was that Elena was doing something no previous specimen had ever attempted. She was organizing. Elena's most important discovery came during her 4th month of captivity. While the Kethmori were conducting their usual tests, she overheard a conversation between 2 researchers that was not translated for her benefit. But by this time, Elena had learned enough of their harmonic language to understand basic concepts. The facility she was imprisoned in was not just a research station. It was the heart of the entire Kethmori civilization. All of their technology, all of their knowledge, all of their cultural advancement came from the beings they had captured and studied over 3 millennia. The crystal ships, the energy weapons, the collective consciousness itself. Everything had been stolen from other species and integrated into Kethmori society. More importantly, all of this stolen knowledge was stored in the facility's central computers. If something happened to this place, the Kethmori would lose everything they had gained from their conquests. They would be reduced to whatever they had been before they started their campaign of galactic theft. Elena realized that she was not just a prisoner in a zoo. She was being held in the most important location in Kethmori space, and she was beginning to understand that the other prisoners around her represented technologies and capabilities that the Kethmori were still studying and had not yet fully integrated. That night, as Elena lay in her cage staring at the ceiling that showed holographic images of distant stars, She made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. She was going to escape and she was going to take everyone with her. But first, she had to teach her fellow prisoners something that no other species had ever learned in 3,000 years of Kethmori conquest. She had to teach them how to fight back. Elena began the next phase of her plan by doing something the Kethmori found deeply puzzling. During her daily tests, she started giving wrong answers to questions she had previously answered correctly. When they presented her with puzzles, she would solve them in inefficient ways that still achieved the correct result. When they asked her about human culture, she would tell them stories that were clearly fictional but present them as if they were true. The researchers were confused by this change in behavior. They ran additional scans on Elena's brain, looking for signs of mental deterioration or illness. They found nothing wrong with her. The human specimen is exhibiting decreased cooperation, one researcher reported to its superiors. Responses show declining accuracy and increasing creative deviation from established patterns. This is within acceptable parameters, came the reply. All specimens show behavioral changes during extended captivity. Continue the research. We are still learning valuable information about human adaptability. What the Kethmori did not understand was that Elena was not deteriorating. She was preparing. And every wrong answer, every inefficient solution, every fictional story was actually a coded message to the other prisoners around her. She was teaching them the most human concept of all, that sometimes the best way to win is to make your enemy think you are losing. Elena's coded messages spread through the prison facility like ripples in a pond. The spider creature, which Elena had learned to call Weaver in her mind, began incorporating her mathematical sequences into increasingly complex web patterns. Other prisoners started to notice these patterns, and slowly, a network of communication began to form. The gaseous being Elena called Shifter proved to be incredibly intelligent. It could change its density and color patterns to create simple images, and it began using these abilities to relay Elena's messages to prisoners in distant parts of the facility. A pattern of colors that meant patience would flow from cage to cage, carried by creatures that could see far beyond human visual range. Elena discovered that many of the prisoners had been watching each other for years, even decades, but had never attempted to communicate. They had accepted their fate as individuals, each alone with their own species' methods of thinking and perceiving the world. But Elena brought something new to the facility, the human concept that different types of intelligence could work together. The breakthrough came when Elena made contact with a crystalline being that existed partially in dimensions she could not see. She called it Resonator because it could create vibrations that traveled through the crystal walls of the facility itself. With Resonator's help, Elena could send messages throughout the entire prison complex in minutes rather than days. Elena learned the stories of her fellow prisoners. Weaver was from a species called the Arachnathi, master builders who could construct cities from their own silk. Their world had been consumed by the Kethmori 200 years ago, and Weaver had watched its entire civilization die. Shifter belonged to the ethereal collective, beings of gas and energy who had once existed as a single planetary consciousness before the Kethmori separated them into individuals and captured the most intelligent fragments. Resonator was even older, one of the last of the harmonic shapers who had taught the Kethmori how to build with crystalline light. The irony was bitter. Resonator's people had created the very technology that was now used to imprison their last survivor. But Elena also met prisoners whose species were more recent conquests. There was a creature she called Metal Meld, whose people could bond with and control any form of technology. There were the Void Dancers, who could move through space without ships by folding reality around themselves. Each species represented abilities that the Kethmori had stolen and turned to their own purposes. As Elena's network grew, she began to understand something that filled her with both hope and fury. The Kethmori were not as powerful as they appeared. Almost everything they had, their ships, their weapons, their technology, had been taken from other species. Strip away the stolen knowledge, and the Kethmori were just another race that had learned to take what others had built. The prisoners began to organize in ways that their captors could not detect. Weaver used its silk to create hidden communication lines between cages. Shifter learned to carry chemical messages in its gaseous form. creating a postal system that the Kethmori sensors could not track. Resonator sent vibrations through the facility's structure that sounded like random noise but actually carried complex information. Elena became the center of this growing network, not because she was the smartest or strongest prisoner, but because she understood something that the others had forgotten: how to hope. "My people built great cities in the clouds," Metalmeld told her during one of their crystal-transmitted conversations. "But the Kethmori came and took our children, our artists, our engineers. They studied us and learned our secrets. Then they destroyed everything we had built. What is the point of resistance now? Our world is dead. Our people are gone." "The point is that you're still alive," Elena replied. "And as long as you're alive, your people aren't really extinct. You carry their knowledge, their culture, their way of thinking. The Kethmori think they've captured that knowledge by studying you, but they're wrong. They can copy what you know, but they can't copy who you are." This message resonated through the prisoner network like a shockwave. For the first time in centuries, beings who had considered themselves the last of their kinds began to think of themselves as something else. The seeds of renewal. Elena's plan began to take shape as she learned more about the facility's structure and purpose. The prison was not just a research station, it was a library. Every piece of knowledge the Kethmori had stolen was stored here, in massive computer systems that the prisoners themselves were connected to. When a Kethmori researcher wanted to understand how the harmonic shapers built with crystal, they would extract the information directly from Resonator's mind. When they needed to improve their ship designs, they would tap into the memories of captured engineers and architects. But the system worked both ways. While the Kethmori were extracting information from the prisoners were connected to the facility's entire knowledge base. They just had never thought to use that connection to their advantage. Elena changed that, working with Metalmeld, who understood technology better than any other prisoner. Elena began to map the facility's computer networks. She discovered that the security systems, the life support, even the Kethmori's communication arrays were all controlled by the same central computers that stored the stolen knowledge. More importantly, she learned that the facility's defenses were designed to keep enemies out, not to keep prisoners in. The Kethmori had never considered the possibility that their specimens might work together to escape, because in 3,000 years of conquest, it had never happened before. Elena's network began to plan their escape with the careful precision of a military operation. Weaver would use its silk to create new connections between computer systems, bypassing security protocols. Shifter would infiltrate the facility's air systems, carrying chemical agents that Metalmeld could synthesize to disrupt Kethmori equipment. Resonator would create vibrations that would interfere with the aliens' collective consciousness, making it harder for them to coordinate their responses. But Elena's most ambitious goal was not just to escape. She wanted to do something that would cripple the Kethmori's ability to continue their galactic conquest. She wanted to steal back everything they had taken. The facility's central computer contained the accumulated knowledge of thousands of species conquered over 3 millennia. Engineering principles, scientific discoveries, cultural achievements, artistic masterpieces. All of it was stored in digital form, stolen from the dead civilizations that had created it. Elena proposed something that no prisoner had ever dared to imagine. They would take it all back. "It's impossible." Metalmeld protested when Elena first outlined her plan. "Even if we could access the central computer, there's nowhere to send the information. Our worlds are gone. Our people are dead." "Then we'll find new worlds," Elena replied. "We'll broadcast everything across the galaxy. Some of it will reach inhabited planets. Some of those planets will be able to use the knowledge. And maybe, just maybe, some of our people's achievements will survive to inspire new civilizations." The idea spread through the prisoner network like wildfire. For the first time since their capture, the prisoners had a goal that went beyond mere survival. They were going to resurrect their dead civilizations, even if only as echoes transmitted across the stars. Elena's plan required perfect timing and coordination between dozens of different species, each with their own unique abilities and ways of thinking. It required them to work together more closely than any group of different species had ever worked before. But Elena had one advantage that the Kethmori had never encountered in 3,000 years of conquest. She was human, and humans had an almost supernatural ability to inspire others to attempt the impossible. As the prisoners made their final preparations, Elena felt a strange sense of peace. She might die in the attempt, but she would die fighting. And if the plan succeeded, the Kethmori would learn too late that they had made a terrible mistake. They had thought they were collecting specimens. Instead, they had created an army. The escape began during the facility's sleep cycle, when most of the Kethmori researchers were dormant and only automated systems maintained the prison. Elena had spent weeks studying their routines, learning when the guards changed shifts and when the security scanners ran their diagnostic cycles. The signal came from Resonator, a deep harmonic vibration that traveled through the crystal walls to every prisoner in the facility. It was a simple message that Elena had taught them all. Now, Weaver moved first. The Arachnathi had spent months secretly spinning silk threads through microscopic cracks in the crystal walls. These threads were thinner than human hair but stronger than steel cables. When Weaver activated them, they began to contract, pulling on carefully placed stress points throughout the prison section. The first cage locks failed simultaneously, not with explosions or alarms, but with quiet clicks as the silk threads pulled circuit connections apart. The automated systems registered the failures, but classified them as routine maintenance issues rather than security breaches. Elena felt her cage door swing open and stepped into the corridor for the first time in 8 months. Around her, dozens of other prisoners were emerging from their own cages. Some moved on legs, others floated, and a few seemed to flow like liquid. But all of them moved with purpose. Shifter had already begun its part of the plan. The gaseous being flowed through the facility's air circulation system, carrying chemical compounds that Metal Meld had synthesized from materials in their food. These compounds would not harm living beings, but they would cause electronic systems to malfunction in subtle ways. Elena ran toward the facility's central computer core, following a route that Resonator had mapped for her using its ability to sense the facility's internal structure. Behind her, the other prisoners split into teams, each with their own objectives. The first Kethmori guards they encountered were completely unprepared for organized resistance. The aliens' collective consciousness made them efficient at following established protocols, but they had no protocols for dealing with escaped prisoners who worked together as a team. When the guards tried to communicate with their supervisors, they found their harmonic transmitters malfunctioning due to Shifter's chemical interference. When they tried to activate security systems, they discovered that Weaver's silk threads had disabled key circuits. When they attempted to use force, they found themselves facing enemies who had been planning this moment for months. Metal Meld bonded with the guards' equipment, turning their own weapons against them. The Void Dancers moved through space in ways that made them impossible to target. Resonator created sound frequencies that disrupted the Kethmori's collective consciousness, causing them to become confused and disoriented. But Elena was not thinking about the fighting behind her. She was focused on reaching the central computer before the Kethmori could activate their emergency protocols. If they managed to lock down the core systems, her plan would fail. She found the computer chamber exactly where Resonator had said it would be, a vast spherical room at the heart of the facility, filled with crystalline storage devices that contained 3,000 years of stolen knowledge. The beauty of the chamber took Elena's breath away. Each crystal pulsed with different colors, representing the accumulated wisdom of entire civilizations. But Elena also saw something that filled her with horror. Connected to the computer system were thousands of small pods, each one containing what looked like a preserved brain. These were not just storage devices. They were the actual minds of beings from conquered species, kept alive and conscious as living libraries. Elena realized that the Kethmori had not just killed their victims after studying them. They had done something far worse. They had kept their minds trapped in these pods, conscious and aware but unable to move or speak, forced to serve as eternal sources of information for their captors. For a moment, Elena stood frozen in the face of such cruelty. Then her rage returned stronger than ever. The Kethmori had not just committed genocide, they had committed a sin against the very concept of consciousness itself. Working quickly, Elena connected Metal Meld's portable interface to the central computer. The being from the technological species had been preparing for this moment, learning to communicate with Kethmori systems through the facility's research network. "I'm in," Metal Meld reported through their communication system. "But Elena, you need to see this. The system is bigger than we thought. They're not just storing information, they're storing actual minds. Millions of them. Elena felt her heart break as she understood the true scope of the Kethmori's crimes. Every species they had conquered, every world they had destroyed, every brilliant mind they had encountered, all of them were here, trapped in digital prison cells, their consciousness preserved as property of the collective. But Elena's grief quickly transformed into determination. If the minds were preserved, then the species were not truly extinct. They could be saved. Can you free them? Elena asked. I can try, Metal Meld replied, but I'll need to broadcast their consciousness patterns to compatible systems across the galaxy. Most will probably be lost in transmission, but some might find new homes in computer networks, robotic bodies, even willing host minds. Do it, Elena said without hesitation. Free them all. As Metal Meld began the massive data transfer, alarms finally started sounding throughout the facility. The Kethmori had realized that this was not a simple attempt. It was an assault on the foundation of their entire civilization. Elena heard the sound of energy weapons firing in the corridors outside the computer chamber. Her fellow prisoners were fighting desperately to hold off the Kethmori security forces, buying her time to complete the data transfer. But the Kethmori were responding with everything they had. Elena heard Weaver's voice over the communication system, tight with pain. They're bringing in heavy weapons. I don't know how long we can hold them. The transfer is at 30%, Metal Meld reported. I need more time. Elena made a decision that would haunt her dreams forever. She activated the facility's emergency lockdown system, sealing all the corridors leading to the computer chamber. This would give Metal Meld the time needed to complete the transfer, but it would also trap her fellow prisoners in those corridors with the Kethmori security forces. Elena, what are you doing? Resonator's voice vibrated through the walls. You've locked us in here with them. I'm sorry, Elena whispered, but this is bigger than just us. We have to free the minds in the computers, all of them. As the data transfer continued, Elena watched the galaxy light up with new signals. Ancient civilizations that had been silent for millennia began to speak again as their preserved minds found new homes in computer networks across 1,000 worlds. Species that the universe had thought extinct started broadcasting their knowledge, their culture, their very essence to anyone who could receive it. The transfer reached 50%, then 60%, then 70%, but the Kethmori were not giving up. Elena heard the sound of cutting tools outside the sealed doors. They were trying to break into the computer chamber, and they would succeed soon. 80%, Metal Meld reported. Elena, they're almost through the door. Elena looked around the chamber at the thousands of brain pods, each one containing a consciousness that had been trapped for decades or centuries. She thought about her dead teammates, about the empty world she had seen in the Kethmori's mind, about all the species that had died believing their achievements would be forgotten. Keep going, she told Metal Meld. No matter what happens to me, keep going until it's finished. The chamber doors exploded inward and Kethmori soldiers poured into the room. Elena stepped between them and Metal Meld, knowing she was about to die but determined to protect the transfer for as long as possible. The lead soldier raised its weapon, and Elena saw her own death reflected in its multifaceted eyes. But she also saw something else, confusion. The soldier's collective consciousness was being disrupted by the thousands of alien minds that were awakening across the galaxy, all of them broadcasting at once. 90%, Metal Meld whispered. Elena smiled and faced her enemies without fear. She had done something that the Kethmori thought was impossible. She had taught the galaxy to fight back. Elena faced the Kethmori soldiers with her hands raised, not in surrender, but to show she held no weapons. Behind her, Metal Meld continued the desperate work of freeing the imprisoned minds. The transfer had reached 95%, but the final 5% contained the most important data, the core memories and cultural knowledge that defined entire civilizations. Stop the transfer, the lead soldier commanded, its harmonic voice cutting through the chaos of alarms. You are destroying property of the collective. Elena felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep inside her. Property? These are people, living, thinking beings that you've kept as slaves for thousands of years. The soldier stepped closer, its weapon trained on Elena's heart. You do not understand. Without the archive, the collective cannot function. You are ending 3 millennia of progress. No, Elena said quietly. I'm ending 3 millennia of theft. As she spoke, Elena could feel the minds in the computer system awakening. The digital consciousnesses that had been trapped for so long were finally free, and they were angry. The facility's systems began to malfunction as thousands of alien minds fought to escape their electronic prisons and spread across the galaxy. The Kethmori soldier hesitated. Through its collective consciousness, it could sense what was happening. Across the galaxy, dead civilizations were returning to life as their preserved minds found new homes in computer networks, robotic bodies, and synthetic forms. The universe was filling with voices that had been silent for centuries. 98%, Metal Meld whispered. Elena knew she was about to die, but she also knew that her death would not stop what they had started. The freed minds were already spreading faster than the Kethmori could track them. Some were reaching primitive worlds and teaching them advanced technology. Others were contacting spacefaring species and sharing knowledge of the Kethmori's weaknesses. But Elena wanted to do more than just free the imprisoned minds. She wanted to send a message that would echo across the galaxy for generations. "You want to know what makes humans different?" Elena asked the soldier. "It's not our intelligence or our technology. It's that we believe every thinking being deserves to be free, even if we have to die to make it happen." The soldier's weapon charged with deadly energy. "Your species will be extinct within the year. We will hunt down every human ship, every human colony. Your defiance will accomplish nothing." Elena smiled. "You're wrong. You already lost the moment you captured me, because I taught the galaxy something you never understood." "What?" "That freedom is contagious." Elena threw herself at the soldier as its weapon fired. The energy beam caught her in the chest, but her momentum carried her forward. She crashed into the alien, sending both of them tumbling into a bank of computer equipment. 100%, Metal Meld shouted triumphantly. "The transfer is complete." Elena felt her strength fading as the energy weapon's effects spread through her body. But she could also feel something else, a presence in her mind that had not been there before. The freed consciousnesses were reaching out to her, trying to save her in the same way she had saved them. "Elena," a voice whispered in her thoughts. It was old and wise, speaking in concepts rather than words. "We can preserve your mind as you preserved ours. You do not have to die completely." Elena considered the offer for a moment. She could live on as a digital consciousness, joining the ancient minds that were now spreading across the galaxy. But she realized that was not what she wanted. "No," she whispered. "My body belongs here with my species. But take my knowledge. Take what I learned about fighting back. Share it with everyone." As Elena died, her memories flowed into the galactic network that Metal Meld had created. Her knowledge of human psychology, her understanding of how to inspire resistance, her techniques for organizing different species to work together. All of it became part of the collective knowledge that was spreading across the galaxy. The Kethmori soldiers destroyed Metal Meld and the other escaped prisoners. But it was too late. The damage was done. Across the galaxy, dead civilizations were waking up, and they all shared one crucial piece of information: how to fight the collective. In the weeks that followed Elena's death, the Kethmori discovered the true cost of their mistake. The freed minds had not just escaped, they had learned from Elena's example how to work together despite their differences. Species that had been enemies for millions of years began cooperating to hunt down Kethmori ships. Ancient defensive technologies that had been forgotten were rebuilt and improved. The Arachnathi consciousness that had once been Weaver found its way to a world of silicon-based creatures and taught them to build ships from crystallized web material. The ethereal collective that included Shifter merged with the quantum computers of a peaceful species and created new forms of technology that could phase through Kethmori defenses. Most devastating of all, the preserved minds retained perfect memories of how the Kethmori fought. Every tactic, every weapon, every strategy that the collective had used over 3 millennia was now known to their enemies. The hunters had become the hunted. Elena's name spread through the galactic network as a symbol of hope and resistance. She became known as the first human, not because she was the first of her species to travel among the stars, but because she was the first to show the galaxy what humans truly were. When humanity finally developed faster-than-light travel 30 years later, they emerged into a galaxy that already knew their story. The first alien ship they encountered was commanded by a digital consciousness that had once been imprisoned by the Kethmori. Its greeting was simple. Welcome to the free galaxy, children of Elena. The humans were amazed to discover that their reputation had preceded them. Everywhere they went, they found species that had been inspired by Elena's example. The concept of fighting for the freedom of others, even at the cost of one's own life, had become a universal ideal. They also learned what had happened to the Keth Mori. The collective had not been destroyed. That would have been too easy. Instead, they had been systematically stripped of everything they had stolen over 3 millennia. Their technology was taken apart and returned to its original creators. Their ships were dismantled and used to build monuments to their victims. Their knowledge was exposed as stolen property and redistributed to the species they had wronged. The Keth Mori themselves were not killed. They were given a choice. They could join the galactic community as equals, contributing their own original discoveries instead of stealing from others. Or they could remain isolated on their homeworld with only the technology they had developed themselves. Most chose isolation. Without their stolen advantages, the Keth Mori were revealed to be a relatively primitive species that had built their empire on the backs of their betters. They retreated to their crystal cities and tried to forget the galaxy they had once dominated. But some Keth Mori chose differently. They abandoned their collective consciousness and learned to think as individuals. They spent their lives trying to make amends for their species' crimes, working to preserve and protect the civilizations that their people had tried to destroy. These reformed Keth Mori became some of humanity's closest allies. Drawn to the species that had taught the galaxy the meaning of sacrifice and redemption, Elena's body was never recovered from the destroyed facility, but the galaxy did not forget her. On 1,000 worlds in 100 different languages, her story was told to children as an example of what one person could accomplish when they refused to accept injustice. The free minds that Elena had liberated built a monument in the empty space where the Keth Mori facility had once existed. It was a simple crystal sculpture that broadcast her final words across the galaxy in every known language. Freedom is contagious. And it was. Elena Vasquez had died as the last human the Keth Mori ever captured, but she lived on as the spark that ignited a galaxy's desire for liberty. Her legacy ensured that no species would ever again face extinction alone, and that the universe would remember the price of freedom. In the end, the Keth Mori's greatest mistake was not underestimating humanity. It was believing that one person's sacrifice could not change the course of history. Elena proved them wrong.